A walk in history, downtown Bennington, Nebraska, now and then, pre-1913. We're going to take a tour through downtown Bennington using old photographs taken prior to the 1913 fire, which destroyed much of the business district, and compare them with current photographs. We're going to be looking at some of the very first businesses in Bennington and what's there now. We've been fortunate that organizations like the Women's Club took the time to document some of our early history, or it might have been lost. You can find some of this information in the books History of Bennington, Nebraska, 1887 to 1967, and the 1992 Centennial book that was put together by Edna Moore, Gary Sathers, and others. We've taken the liberty to use many of those old photographs to put this tour together. We're going to start our tour at the intersection of 156th Street and Bennington Road. We'll head south on 156th Street to Warehouse. We'll go down Warehouse Street to Stark Street and turn south across where the old tracks were. Then we'll go up to Allen and South 2nd Street or Main Street, then proceed down Main Street until we get back to Warehouse. Now the west side of 156th Street could actually be called Old Town because that's where the first businesses were. They were actually built outside of the city limits to take advantage of the business that was created when Bennington was built. This triangular section of land was owned by Klaus Oft and was the first addition annexed by the town. Now let's set the mood for this tour. Imagine it's more than 100 years ago. Can you start to smell the kerosene from the lanterns lighting this room? Can you smell the smoke from the wood and coal being burned in town to heat the rooms and cook meals? When we step outside, can you smell the pungent odor of manure and that of the horses sweating? Can you hear them swat flies with their tails? How about that clippity-clop of a horse and carriage going by? Can you hear chickens and hogs next door? Hey, how about that door that slammed on somebody's outhouse? You know, it was quite a different lifestyle a century ago. So let's begin our walk through town, and remember, be careful where you step. You don't want to track any manure into the businesses. We're starting on the corner of 156th and Old Bennington Road, and we're looking west. Today the southwest corner is the site of Nate's Grill. More than a century ago, the first store was located here. In 1887, Herman Timmy built the first store in Bennington. It also held Bennington's first post office. Before that, our closest post office was in a sod cabin that was in a small community of Hayes, which was located 2 miles north of town. Today, that community is gone. Timmy built one of the first homes, and it was located where the police garage is now sitting. The barrels in that shed were probably full of salt. A lot of salt was used to keep things from spoiling. An interesting story about Herman is that he was our first justice of the peace, and he took the town's first census when the migrant sugar beet harvesters were in town. This ensured that we had enough people to allow us to incorporate in 1892. To the left of the shed is Ed Cook's livery stable, and we'll get a better look at that in a little later. We'll move a little further down the street. Now we're standing in front of the library looking west across 156th Street and Warehouse. Today, residential houses occupy this site. Here's another view of that area taken from the top of the old elevator, and we're looking west again at 156th Street. On the extreme right is Timmy's store, where we had just been. Just to the left is Ed Cook's livery, and south of that is Hans Snyder's saloon. All three of these businesses were built before 1888. Across the railroad tracks was Klaus Off's grist mill. That's where farmers brought their grain to have it ground into flour and meal. The old mill was powered by the Papio Creek, and as you can see in this 1903 photograph, the creek in those days flooded quite a bit. Now we're back to the library building looking across 156th Street. This photograph recently showed up, and we believe it's a close-up of the Hans Snyder's Inn and Saloon. It was probably the first inn and saloon in town. It matches the building in the previous photograph, and if you look closely at the gentleman on the boardwalk on the right, he's wearing a badge. Hans's brother was one of the early town marshals. Hans sold the business, and the building later burned. Now we've gone further south, just south of the library to the Papio Creek, and we're looking west at the 156th Street Bridge. Notice how deep that creek is today. This is the same spot more than a century ago. Here are four gentlemen trying out their boat. Notice how shallow the creek is. The Papio Creek was important to the community. It not only powered the grist mill, its ice was also harvested in the winter and stored in ice houses to be used during summer months. The town had several ice houses. Ice blocks were sold and used in real ice boxes to help keep milk, meat, and other foods fresh. Flooding was a major problem in the valley because the creek was so shallow and crooked. Normally, large floods occurred every 10 years or so. Flooding remained a terrible problem until the 1930s, when the Corps of Engineers deepened and straightened the creek channel with a mechanical dredge. Okay, let's turn around and head downtown. Now we've walked down past Centennial Park to the intersection of Warehouse and Molly Streets. On the corner to the east of us is T&R Auto. More than a century ago, this was the location of a mercantile store. Mangold's Mercantile was built on the corner in 1898 and offered just about anything you'd like to buy. Look at all those hitching posts to tie your horse. That's Mr. and Mrs. George Mangold and their son Walter standing by the door. The Mangolds offered groceries and general mercantile on the first floor and dishes and housewares upstairs. If they didn't have it, it could be ordered and delivered by train. If we look to the south today, we see AB Storage and U-Haul Rental. A century ago, that was the location of Henry Arp's implement business. It sat on the south side of the road close to the tracks. Warehouse Street was named for its warehouses and the businesses that housed merchandise and farm produce for the railroad. A little later, around 1910, Ort and Glant built a cement factory a little east of this site. The foundations of the buildings prior to 1910 in town were made of brick. After that date, most of the basements were made of Bennington manufactured cement blocks. Now let's continue on our tour east down Warehouse Street. Now we're looking down toward the intersection of Warehouse and Stark Streets. At that same location, cattle and other livestock were often herded down Warehouse Street between the stockyards and the slaughter area, which was located west of town, and the railroad station that was located to the east. In those days, having livestock in town was normal. Everyone had horses, a few chickens, for eggs, and even a hog or two in the backyard. These feeders were for Charlie Gutch. Now let's get to the intersection and take a look at the businesses on the lower Stark Street area. When we look north along the east side of the street today, there's two prominent business locations that held businesses more than a century ago. One is where Jeff Priest has an office shown in the center of this photograph, and the other is on the corner to the left in a building owned by Bruce Johnson. This is what that portion of town looked like about 1900. In 1888, Eggertoff built a livery stable where Jeff Priest's building is today, and this photograph shows the store on the corner was owned by Nick Witt. Now, Nick was a chairman of the city board in 1913, and we'll see the front of this building later on the tour when we go down Main Street. We know this photograph was taken prior to 1906, and if you'll notice, the Legion Hall wasn't built yet. If you'll notice, there's two windmills in this photo, one behind the livery and the other one behind George Mangold's home. At this time, there wasn't any running water or plumbing in town. Water came from windmills and hand pumps, and hot water came from being heated on the kitchen stove. Here we're standing on the east side of Stark Street looking west at the parking lot in back of the warehouse. More than a century ago, this was really a busy corner. 125 years ago, Eggertoff built a blacksmith shop there. He leased the business out to Bert Seymour. Here you see Eggert, George Mangold, and Bert. Bert operated the blacksmith shop until it burned down in the 1913 fire, and then he moved across the street and built an auto repair shop. Now let's take a quick look inside the blacksmith shop, and be careful walking past those horses so you don't get bit or kicked. Now if your wagon or buggy had a bad wheel, this is where you got it fixed. In those days you didn't have flats. You had a broken wheel, and on the right there's a pile of new wheels that you could buy. Not only did you have to buy shoes for yourself, but you also had to buy them for your horses. And that's what the anvil and forge is for in the background. This is where your horses got shoed. Now let's go and turn south on Stark and cross the railroad tracks and work our way down to Bunn's Park. Today that road and park no longer exists. Now if we turn south, this is a photo of the intersection of Stark and Warehouse Streets. Now Stark Street actually continued through this area and then paralleled the creek to the southeast. On the southwest corner of Stark and Warehouse, where Apollo Storage now sits, a century ago we would have saw the Mangold Brothers Lumberyard. Later it was owned by the Fremont Christersons, and later by Don and Jerry Miles. That's the old grain elevator in the background where that 1903 photograph of the flood was taken. That's where a lot of farmers sold their grain. The grain was stored in the elevator and then transferred to railroad cars for delivery to markets. The first elevator was powered by steam power. However, it burned down, and it was replaced with a structure which was horse-powered. That power was needed to lift the grain into the bins. Now, if we would have turned around and looked to the east, we would have seen the Bennington depot as we crossed the tracks. It looks like the boys were waiting for the noon train. In those days, we had 6 trains that came through town each day. The train was a popular way to travel if you had pocket money. You could ride to Irvington or Washington for a dime, and a round-trip ticket to Fremont cost you 40 cents. That sounds cheap, but for some people that was half a day's wages. Now we're going to continue south on Stark Street to Bunn's Park, and that area has been totally changed by the dredging of the Papio Creek and construction of many buildings in that area. Looking southeast across the tracks, we'd see what many referred to as Bennington Park or Bunn's Park for the family who owned the land. If Bennington was known for anything in those days, it was for this park and the many events held here. We had a wonderful park. Baseball was a huge sport in those days. City teams would travel by train to play here. The Omaha Indians and teams from Gretna, Louisville, Elkhorn, and other cities around the area played against Bennington's home team here. In those days, we didn't have a high school ball team. We didn't even have a high school here in town. The community in those days held a harvest festival in late fall. It was usually a 3-day celebration that drew crowds from surrounding communities and even Omaha. It was like a state fair. Stock, vegetables, and baked goods were judged, and as you can see here, they even had a marching band parade. Hundreds of people would come on the train to attend these festivities. While baseball was the major daytime activity, dances were the major draw at night. Everyone wanted to go to the dance to have fun. Girls and boys learned how to dance in those days, and there were usually 3 places where one met their spouse, either in school, in church, and more often than not, at a dance. That was the major form of entertainment in those days. Weddings and anniversaries were commonly celebrated by the entire community. Others, towns, organizations, and even Omaha businesses also enjoyed Bunn's Park. The train made it easy to get there. This is an example of one of those celebrations. The Swift Packing Company was found in South Omaha, and they celebrated their 2nd annual outing to Bunn's Park in 1908. This button was your ticket to get in. Now, let's move to another part of town. We're now at the intersection of Allen and South 2nd Street, looking west, down Main Street as it looks today. Here's the same site a century ago. Some of the buildings are still the same. To our right was the modern Woodman's of America building. Today that's the Legion Hall. Next to it was the Mangold and Glant Bank. And a little further west was Kirshner's Mercantile Store, and actually the 2nd location of our post office. Across the street to our left was the printing office where the Bennington Herald, our town's newspaper, was published. Next to it was the Slits or Etler's Saloon, and at the end of the block was Fredrickson's Store. Now let's stick our head into Woodman's Hall and see what's going on. In the old days, they used to play basketball in this building. That's Lenny Mangold in the middle of the top row. He became our postmaster years later. Now, playing basketball in a hall had its challenges. You couldn't arch your shots because the ball had hit the ceiling, and you had to dodge the pot-bellied stoves located on both ends of the floor. The one nice thing was that you could play out of the weather, and you had a wood floor to play on. Now let's head back to the sidewalk. Now if we looked further to the west, right next door to the Legion Hall, this is one of the original buildings that was built in 1888. A century ago, this building was built by Woolley and Stratton in 1888. They operated the first bank in Bennington. A year later, it was bought and operated by Mangold and Glant. Right here you see the Mangold brothers. John, George, and Peter. Now let's look across the street. On the south side of the street, there's another original building, or at least the first floor is. Today it's the white-fronted apartment building. The second floor was added years later when the building was enlarged to create the Lyman Hotel. We don't have any original photographs of the exterior of the original building, but we do have one of the inside, so let's go inside for a minute. Now, we just entered the Joseph Slits Bar. The company bought this lot in 1888 and built a saloon. That's John and Henry Mueller behind the bar, and I believe they tended bar in every saloon in town. At one time, John operated the Puritan Bakery, and his brother Henry owned a candy store in town. The location of these businesses remain a mystery. Now let's go back outside and go next door. On the west corner of this block sits HMS Realty. This building was built sometime after the 1913 fire. The date near the roof is wrong. Bruce just added it for looks. The first business on this corner was Fredrickson's Mercantile Store. This photo was taken about 1896. This building burned down during the downtown fire of 1913. The photo's sort of poor, but let's take a look inside. We're fairly sure this was taken inside Fredrickson's store. We don't know who these people are, but we suspect some of them are the Fredrickson's family. While we don't know the specific information, we do know they had 4 girls and 2 boys. It appears they sold groceries, canned goods, and cigars. There's a root beer sign on the back wall and a straw dispenser showing they had a soda fountain, and they probably served meals too. Now we find ourselves at the intersection of Main Street and Stark looking south. Now this is the same site over a century ago. Now to our left, looking south down Warehouse Street, we see Fredrickson's Mercantile, which we were just in. Further south is Off's Livery Stable. In the background, across Warehouse Street and to the right is the old depot station. And then coming back toward us is Seymour's Blacksmith Shop. Then there's Off's Ice House. And just to the right is Off's Hotel. Now all these but 2 buildings burned down in the 1913 fire. The depot burned down years later, and the old livery stable was torn down. Now we're down Main Street a little further, and we miss the northeast corner of Stark and Main Street. Here we're looking back at the old bank building to the east, which is now the location of Omaha Silk Screening. This building was originally constructed by Mangold and Glant as their new bank in 1914. However, a century earlier, you would have seen Kirshner's General Mercantile Store on that corner. It was probably built in 1888. The store served as the city's post office for a short while. Kirshner's store burned down during that 1913 fire. And as you can see by the street banner, a baseball game is scheduled to be played down at Bunn's Park. Now if we look at the southwest corner, we see the Daycare and Learning Center. This building was built just after the 1913 fire. Originally, this was where Off's Hotel was located. In the early days, Bennington had a water cistern located right in the middle of the intersection. Here's the fire department testing their new hand pump. However, we believe the photograph was taken prior to 1898. So Let's take a look inside the hotel. This is Otto Grossen, who operated the saloon after 1899 and until the building burned in 1913. This building housed the saloon, hotel, restaurant, and opera house. Now, stepping outside, we'll look across the street to the north. The building on the northwest corner is the original structure built in 1888. To the day, the building is owned by Bob and Jan McKelvey and houses Bob's Antique Cars and is the future home of Bennington's Historical Society's museum. Starting in 1888, the east half of this building was operated as a hardware store, and that continued for almost 90 years. Augustus Whitty had the first hardware business here. Here we can see Doc Hickey and his horse-drawn sleigh in front of the building. He operated a drugstore on the west side of the building. Now we'll travel a little further west. Now this was an empty lot until 1911, when the Bennington State Bank was built. This may have been the first brick building built on Main Street, and it survived the 1913 fire. The Bennington State Bank served the community from 1911 to 1928. Land speculation caused both Bennington banks to close in 1928. That was the start of the Great Depression. Now let's take a look next door, a little further to the west. Just west of the old bank building is the apartment buildings today. Now this building takes up 2 lots and originally was the site of 2 different businesses. The left lot was the location of Off's Harness Shop, and we don't have photographs of it. However, we do for the business that occupied the right side of this building. So let's take a look at it. This photograph was taken about 1900, and it shows Pete Peterson's meat shop. This is his wife and 2 daughters, Leona and Rose, standing by the door. Bennington had a strong German background, and that's reflected in the signs here. Schleswig-Holstein is the northern province of Germany where many of the early settlers came. Fleischladen is German for meat shop. Here we are inside of Peterson's meat market, and this is Mrs. Peterson minding the store. You have to remember there wasn't any refrigeration in those days. Meat was smoked, salted, canned, and dried to keep it from spoiling. Animals were routinely slaughtered in town to provide fresh meat. Pete butchered in the back of the store, and it appears that animals were slaughtered down by some holding pens located across the creek from our police station and down by the football fields in Jip's farm. Now just to the west of this building is George Mangold's store, which we saw earlier. In 1911, it's believed a fire started there which burned down their store, Peterson's meat shop, and possibly the harness shop. Now starting up the block on the right, we see Bob McKelvey's building. Next to it is the Sportsman's Bar, and we have a couple of empty lots today. And then there's the yellow building, which is being used for offices. Turning back the clock a century, we see Augustus Whitty's hardware store to the extreme right. Then to the left is the Bennington House, which was a saloon and hotel. Next to it was Hanson's meat shop, and to the left was Mangold's store. Now after the 1911 fire, George Mangold built a new store across the street. We're looking at it now. This picture was taken sometime between 1911 and the 1913 fires. The Bennington house was destroyed by the 1913 fire, and the rest of the buildings survived. Now let's go into Mangold's store and see if George is busy. Well, there's George on our left behind the counter. Now there wasn't any shopping carts in those days. You gave the merchant your order and they gathered the groceries. Now stores were quite different in those days. This is where you primarily got canned and dried goods. No frozen food section, no bakery, no meat sections. They were separate stores. Fresh fruits were available only in season, although you might be able to get potatoes, onions, and possibly dried apples year-round. Now it's time to leave. Let's go outside. Here we're looking at the front of Mangold's store. Sharon Rogers told me a story about her father Leonard getting sick of candling eggs when he was a boy. That was a process of holding an egg up to a lit candle to see if it was fresh. If you didn't want to sell rotten eggs, you had to do that in the old days. Now, cash money was really scarce, and there were no credit cards in those days, although in some cases you could buy on credit depending upon your reputation and upon the store. Now, farmers commonly bartered fresh eggs or produce for groceries. If you had chickens and extra eggs, you could sell them at Mangold's store. Now here sets 250 dozen eggs. They called them cackleberries in those days, waiting for shipment, probably either to Benson or Omaha or maybe even Fremont. Just further to the west and next door, today we see the northeast corner of Molly and Main Street, and this business is Unique Rides. A century ago, this was a large two-story building which housed several businesses. Spethman's Saloon sat on that corner more than a century ago. That building housed a hotel and even a bowling alley upstairs. It also had a wooden shoe factory that was found on the north side of the building. Let's go ahead and go inside the saloon. This photograph was taken inside Spethman's Saloon in 1901. We found the date on the calendar on the left. We have two examples of how businesses were lit in those days from this photograph. You can see the kerosene lantern hanging from the ceiling. And right above and in the middle of the two gentlemen, you'll see a pipe coming down from the ceiling to gas mantles. Carbide gas lighting was popular but very dangerous, and it caused many homes and business fires. Now against the back wall you'll see a tall ice box. They cooled their beer with ice harvested from the mill pond during the past winter. This photo was taken in August. No air conditioners, not even a fan. Can you imagine how hot it was? And take a look at the sawdust around the spittoons, just in case somebody missed. This is our last stop. We hope you enjoyed your tour. We hope you've learned a little bit about Bennington and how dramatically technology has changed the way we all live. It's changed the landscape in the terms of there's more trees today and our lands are much more productive in terms of crops. Transportation has changed from horses to cars and from trains to trucks. Streets are now paved and not covered by horse manure. Homes and businesses are no longer illuminated by gas or kerosene lanterns, nor are they heated with wood or coal. And what about bathrooms? How many of you have used an outhouse or chamber pot, or have had to actually pump your own water? We'd like to invite you to join the Bennington Historical Society and come help us learn more about the community and preserve our history. Our meetings are the first Wednesday of each month at the Library Community Room at 6:30 p.m. and that's the east side entrance. Check out our new website and see old photographs and what the Society is doing. For more information, call 402-614-7509. and thank you again for watching.